All right, well, we are at 1 o'clock now, so welcome everybody and welcome back to the second in our series of Champlain Valley thinning meetings. Today we're going to be discussing thinning at the 10 and 12 millimeter timing. So if you're joining Zoom for the first time in a while, just a quick couple of reminders. We do have you muted as you entered the Zoom meeting today. If you could, throughout the presentation, just keep yourself muted and your video off. That way we can conserve some bandwidth. And then after the presentation, you're more than welcome to type in your questions, or you can unmute yourself and ask them directly. To do that, you can hover over the bottom of your screen and you should see this toolbar pop up, and you'll find the mute and unmute button and the video button. You should also be able to find the chat icon. That'll open up the chat box, and you can also enter in any questions that you have during the presentation using that. Just allowing more people into the meeting. All right, so with that, I just wanted to give a review of what I saw driving around the Champlain Valley this morning. So from the orchards I visited, it looks like set is looking very strong and crop load remains heavy on most of our varieties. I was looking at Max, Honeycrisp, Snapdragons, Galas, really across the board, things are set up very nicely and look like they're still hanging on. Of course, we're not too far out from our more recent petal fall applications, but certainly looks like things are still hanging on pretty strong. Most clusters look like they have their kings along with 2 or more strong laterals still hanging. So it looks like there's certainly more thinning to be done. Where cold damage occurred, it looks like the kings are missing in some spots, but even without those kings, those clusters still have many strong laterals, oftentimes 2, 3, 4. So still very high amount of crop load out there. Also wanted to mention, it looks like there is slightly less fruit remaining in blocks that were thinned more aggressively at bloom with ammonium thiosulfate applications with the pollen to growth model. But even in those blocks, it's looking like there are still a lot of clusters that still have their kings on, and even there are still a lot of laterals as well. Then looking at fruit size, many of our kings now are in that 10 to 12 millimeter range in our max, and Honeycrisp as well, Gala, we're all within that window. Some of our later varieties, certainly Snapdragon being one of them, are lingering behind a little bit. They bloomed a bit later with this long bloom that we had. So they're more in the 7s and 8s from what I've been seeing today. So with that, I would like to turn things over to Dr. Robinson to tell us about his recommendations for this thinning timing.
Thanks, Mike. I'll just start this screen sharing really quick. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to be back talking about thinning. I'm so glad to hear the report that Mike gave about the relatively good set. Thanks, Mike, for all your background work to try to make this meeting a meaningful help. As we remember the precision chemical thinning protocol, we're at the main thinning window. And over a period of time of 16 years, where we ran these timing studies in Geneva, this period between 10 and 13 millimeters is when we get the maximum efficacy of any of the hormone type thinners. It's also a critical spray because we now have some way to estimate what the previous sprays did, blossom thinning or petal fall, using the fruit growth rate model. And that allows us to calibrate better what we want to do at this moment. The carbon balance model you'll see in just a few minutes is critical to our decisions. It is important, though, that we measure fruits again after this spray, because it's likely that this spray will not be as effective as we want because of cool temperatures that are forecasted in the next few days. But according to this design, this protocol, there's still one additional moment to spray, which will be next week. It'll probably be middle to end of next week. So I don't know, Mike, if you're planning to have another one of these discussions, but it probably should be somewhere in the Tuesday, Wednesday time period of next week. Let me just review what we've seen so far, and I rely on Mike for a lot of this. There has been some variable bloom across the region and across the state. There was some frost damage to kings, although it's less than what we thought originally, but there are some places where kings are missing. Some of that may have also been due to relatively poor pollination weather during the early part of bloom. When the kings were open, I know the bees flew in the later part of bloom, so the sets of lateral flowers is probably really good. I appreciate Mike's assessment from this morning because it looks like we are in really good shape for a great crop in the Champlain Valley on almost all blocks. Now, when we look back at what happened with the thinning, I'm glad to hear, although I didn't put that bullet point on this slide, that the ATS sprays at Bloom did have an influence. And if you sprayed ATS and you just want to look at it yourself, the goal of the ATS sprays was to keep the king and knock off all the laterals. So if things worked perfectly, you'd have only one flower left per cluster with no laterals. But as Mike indicated, it didn't work perfectly. And so we still have 2, in some cases 3 laterals there, but that's better than having, 4 or 5 laterals. So I think that it was worth the effort this year to put on the ATS. When we move forward, last week, you'll remember at the petal fall timing, we were under warmer conditions and we encouraged everybody to spray petal fall sprays. And we should be seeing the influence of that now. But as Mike was telling me earlier in the day, there hasn't been enough time to get the second measurement on the fruit growth rate model. And so it's still unclear exactly how many fruits are still growing and how many are falling off following that petal fall spray. But hopefully when Mike gets the second measurements, he can send out an email to you indicating that, because you'll see that I am going to be recommending waiting a little longer near the end of this coming window, just because it's so cool. Today's a warm day, but then we're followed by several cool days, including one that's not going to crack 60. So that leads me to the next to the last bulleted point. It appears that our main thinning spray is going to go on under cooler conditions and therefore won't be as potent, as powerful as we hope. And there will be little carbohydrate deficit to help. So that's going to argue, as you'll see that I'm going to repeat several times in this presentation, that we should be putting on full rates at this timing because of the cool conditions. We still suggest you use the degree day calculator on the carbohydrate model to best time your sprays. And so let's look at that. This is the printout from Peru's carbohydrate model that I just ran an hour ago. And it shows that bloom was somewhere around May 12th. And when we go forward to the petal fall time period for thinning, it was a relatively narrow compressed window of just 3 days, maybe 4 days, because it was warm and fruits grew through that 5 to 6 millimeter really quickly. We'd recommended basing the timing on degree days between 100 and 130, and it went really quick. But now we look at this next window, which basically starts today at Peru, but it's a wide window, 6 days, maybe 7 days wide, because fruits will slow down in their growth because of the cool weather. So you can see from the curve that the petal fall sprays went on under reasonably decent deficit. It wasn't as good as we had hoped, but if you waited late into that petal fall period and you got your petal fall sprays on late, you can see that the deficit disappeared and we almost back to zero. So the petal fall sprays that went on the early side would be better and more effective than those that went on the late side of that window. But now you can see that as we're entering into the main thinning window, whether Mother Nature's not cooperating. We get pure surpluses above zero up and around the 25 today, tomorrow, and the next day. Now that's as far forward as the carb model predicts. But if we jump down to the table, we can get some indication of what's going to happen. So here we are on this line right here is May 26th. Supposed to hit 90 in Peru. That would be shocking. And so on that particular day, there's a 90 gram deficit. And so you probably could get reasonable thinning. But the problem is that it's bounded on both sides, and particularly tomorrow and the next day, by these really cool temperatures, 66, then a 57, then a 65, with relatively cool nights and bright sunshine. So beautiful days, nice cool days. But those give surpluses of carbohydrates. The fruits are growing slow. They don't need a lot of carbon, and therefore the tree has extra. And so every fruit stays on. When you look at the 7-day average starting today, it's above zero, but we do have at least this 1 day of good deficits. But then as we move forward, it keeps going up in carbohydrate balance. Now that's as far forward as it will predict, because we don't have forecasts of light conditions more than that 7 days, 5 to 6 days out. Therefore, I can't make an average because I lack the next day. But let's just look at what happens with temperatures. Temperatures will stay in the 60s, but by May 31st, which is Monday, we go back to the mid 70s, and Tuesday, June 1st, we go to 76. Now, if we look at this last column of numbers, the degree days, the window of 10 to 13 millimeters highlighted by a black box around them. So it starts today and it goes at least through Monday. And Tuesday, June 1st, we're not much past the 258. So I would probably even include Tuesday, June 1st. So anytime in these windows, it's legitimate to spray, but I'm going to suggest that we not jump. Let's wait, because the temperatures are so cool, and that maybe the day to go could be Monday. Now, I realize that's Memorial Day, but that's kind of the nature of apples. It seems like every year at the station, we're spraying Memorial Day. So I apologize for that. You might miss your holiday with your family, but that looks to me like the best day to spray, assuming that it's not too windy and not too rainy. But you could also go to June the 1st, Tuesday. Now that would apply for everybody in the Peru area, and Champlain and Chazy, which is more north, might even extend to Wednesday, June 2nd. But unfortunately for Will Gunnison down south of this region, I don't know if he can wait that long. And so maybe today's the best day for you, Will, at least because there's 90 degrees forecast today, and you'll get some benefit from the heat from today, despite the fact that it's going to cool down really quick tomorrow and the next day. Last thing I'll note on this slide is previously during the petal fall, we had green in these boxes, meaning good thinning. But now it's turned to blue, which means mild thinning. We're just not going to get the amount of thinning we need. On the positive side over here, this little L with a green circle means there's low risk of overthinning. So for those people that are really nervous about overthinning, there's low risk of that. But on the negative side, it just may not give us all that we need unless we wait down here to either Sunday, Monday, or Tuesday of next, of the coming week. So based upon that discussion, let me summarize some suggestions. The best timing appears to be today, Wednesday, through next Monday. I suggest that any one of those days will probably give mild thinning, but the first half of those, the temperatures will be in the 60s, and I think we'll get less than we want. We need good thinning. But if we wait to pick up those 70s in early next week, I think we'll end up with good thinning, and the fruit still will not be too big. Now, this is something you might want to check by measuring fruits, because once they get past 13 millimeters, then we don't get as much thinning. So I think they won't get past the 13 millimeters before Monday. And so Monday, Memorial Day would be probably the best day to thin. On average, so far, it looks like the carbohydrate balance is going to be positive, about 20 grams. But I only can predict right now the early part of this thinning window. So I suggest that you check the model in a few days and see what the carbohydrate balance looks like on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, the 7-day average. And then probably, I'm hoping it looks better, either a deficit or it'll be close to zero instead of a surplus. The carbohydrate surplus and cool temperatures give mild thinning. That argues that if you're thinning in this window, you got to use full rates. And full rates plus, you'll see on the model, if we go back, it's going to start telling you to increase chemical rate by 30%. But unfortunately, I'm worried that this spray will not give sufficient thinning. And so we'll most likely have to come back with a rescue spray, which I had hoped to avoid. A couple more suggestions. We know that in this window, when fruits are between 10 and 13, and let me just digress and say that's really the bulk of the kings. Now, there may be a few little laterals that are really small, but they're probably falling off anyway. I'm talking about the biggest king and the biggest lateral being somewhere in this range. No, most thinners have their strongest effect in this time period. And so this is when we can get the most thinning, but without a carbohydrate deficit the next few days, we won't get the thinning we want. And that argues for full rates plus. You should be confident that there won't be over thinning, because without carbohydrate deficits, we don't ever get over thinning. Now, what are your options? There's really 4 options of chemicals to spray at this timing. One is 7 in oil, and that seems to work fairly well if you've got deficits, but I don't have that condition this year. Plus, oil is a problem for many growers who start switching to Captan around this time. If you use oil, you cannot spray Captan either 7 days before the spray or 7 days after. What the oil does is penetrates Captan molecules into the leaf and they cause leaf damage. So when Captan sits on the surface of the leaf, it's a great fungicide, but when the plant takes it in, then it's toxic to the plant. So it's Captan is the problem. So I kind of discard that option for most of us in New York, and it's the following three that I think are the best. Maxellin 7 works great if temperatures are 70 to 75. That's another reason to wait till the end of the window, because that's probably when we'll get those temperatures. NAN7 can work under cooler conditions, but it'll be milder results. But it's the preferred product for things like Honeycrisp and Macintosh. A third or fourth option is just to eliminate Carbaryl and put Maxell and NA together. If any of you are participating in marketing programs that require Carbaryl-free fruit, this is our recommendation, and we've tested it for at least 5 years now, and it doesn't work quite as good as Maxellin 7 or NAN 7, but it works pretty close to as good as that combination. Now, specific varieties. Mike mentioned that he's seen strong set on galas everywhere. So I think they need a high dose of Maxell, but I would suggest that we wait and spray this when we get closer to having 70 degrees plus during the day, and that 75 would be great. My recommendation is to put on a full dose of 64 ounces of Maxell, which is based of tree row volume dilute basis, and a pint of Carbaryl. I want to pause here just to review so that there's no confusion. When I say 64 ounces tree row volume dilute, you've got to think of it this way. If you've got a younger orchard and you measure the tree row volume based on the formula that Cornell recommends that I put near the tables of thinning, and it measures, let's say, 100 gallons, because it's thin, narrow, you've hedged it, and it just measures 100 gallons. Then you would put 64 ounces on in 100 gallons of water and you'd be just perfect. But let's suppose it's a more mature tall spindle, or even a more vertical axe type semi-dwarf, and the real tree row volume is 200 gallons, but you're only spraying 100 gallons, so you have to put twice that in the tank. So it's a 2x of chemical. Often, in many blocks in New York, that translates into a full gallon of Maxell. So if you're taking my recommendation and putting on 64 ounces, which is half a gallon, and the trees are really 200-gallon trees, 64 ounces in the acre is not enough. It has to be closer to a gallon to the acre. Now, there's all kinds of tree row volumes in between. Suppose it was a 150-gallon tree row volume, halfway between 100 and 200. Then it'd be halfway between a half gallon and a full gallon. It'd be 3/4 of a gallon of Maxell per acre. And that's the same with all of these. In addition, if the model suggests when the day you spray to increase chemical 15 or 30%, do it. If it suggests decrease the chemical 15 or 30%, do it. Now let me move with that, a small deviation in topic. Let me move to Honeycrisp. What I like at this timing is 3 ounces of NA. That's 7.5 parts per million tree row volume basis. But again, you have to adjust for tree row volume. Now let me digress again and just talk about the Carbaryl. Carbaryl doesn't need to be factored with tree row volume, just 1 pint per 100 gallons, because that's all it's soluble. If you double the Carbaryl, the extra pint isn't in solution. It's just mixed and then sprayed on the leaf, and it's deposited and dries on the leaf, but not taken into the plant. And that extra pint serves as an insecticide, but not as a thinner. Now that's true as long as there's not re-wetting. So if you expect some rain and you put 2 pints in, you get more thinning than what you expected. Now, if it's cool weather, maybe you want that. But I'm going to give you an alternative recommendation at the end instead of doubling the Carbaryl. For Macintosh, I like a lower dose of NA, 2 ounces or 5 parts per million tree row volume basis, dilute basis. For Empire, I like the high rate of Maxell. But here I want to caution you. Around the state, we're seeing a lot of Empire Kings that were damaged. For some reason, Empire is sensitive to that damage to Kings. If you don't have the Kings, I would reduce that rate by a third, or just basically 48 ounces, a quarter. Cortlands, I like 2 ounces of NA alone. Now, Snapdragon, when they're really young, they seem easier to thin, and we can get by with a half rate of Maxell and 7. But as Snapdragon gets older, more than 5 years, and it's not that strong of a growing tree, it's a weak growing tree, We cannot thin it with low doses of Maxell. You have to have the full rate of Maxell. Now, Mike was telling me earlier where some people had sprayed ATS on Snapdragon that maybe it thinned, might have even over thinned. I don't know. Be interesting to see. So you have to go look at each Snapdragon block separately, and you also have to take into account whether you used ATS on it or not. But where you didn't, I'm expecting you to have to spray a full dose on Snapdragon, tree row volume dilute basis. Now at the end, if you want to ask about other varieties, we could do that. I just wanted to put a few down. It will be critical after this spray because I don't think it's going to work as well as we want to measure fruitlet diameters on this fruit growth rate model. I know Mike is doing a couple of blocks, but that's not enough. I hope some of you will do this on your own. Use the Malusim phone app because it includes error detection rules, which will help eliminate problems that I've seen in the past. But I hope that if you take those measurements, you will let me know and let me look at it. I can look at it directly at malusim.org. Now I want to go back to this slide and just talk about that measurement. Let's suppose that you sprayed tomorrow on May 27th at 207 degree days. Maybe we could have even put it today. The first measurement should be 50 degree days later, but you see, because it's so cool, and there's this 57 and then some mid 60s, we don't get very many degree days every day, just 10 or 15 maximum. And so you'd want to wait to take the first measurement 50 degree days later, which would put you all the way down to Tuesday, June the 1st for your first measurement. Now, beyond that, let's assume it stays warm and there's only 3 more days to the second measurement. So you'd be taking your second measurement on Friday of next week. But that will still be soon enough to decide whether you have to spray an additional rescue spray treatment. I put this out and want to emphasize this, that don't take the first measurement too early. Just wait till Memorial Day or the day after Memorial Day and then take your first measurement, assuming you spray then. Now, if you wait till Monday to spray, then that.
Terrence, you're starting to break up. Maybe if you can turn your video off, that might preserve your bandwidth a little bit.
Hear me? I don't know how to turn on video without stopping screen sharing. Is that better, Mike?
Yep, I can hear you better and we can still see your screen. Let's give this a try. Thanks.
Okay. So the presentation is not more than just to finish this in a summary. I really want you to assess each block, each variety, particularly pay attention with Empires. If the King's there, pay attention with Snapdragon, whether you got the thinning at petal or at bloom that you thought, what the crop load really is. Time your spray based on this degree day accumulation. But it looks like that we'll need to wait till the later part of that thinning window. We need to assess the response, measure fruitlet diameter, and then that will still give us a chance to apply a final spray at 18 to 20 if we don't get the thinning we need. Let me just pause and digress here a minute and tell you the question that came up with a couple days ago is if you thinned, let's suppose your target was 150 fruits and you had gotten it down to 250 fruits, 100 more than your target. Would you spray again? And my answer has been that if I'm 50 fruits over the target, more than 50 fruits over the target, I would spray again. If I'm really close, 50 fruits or less, I just want to fix that with hand thinning. But if your target was 150 fruits and you're at 250 or 300, I think you've got to say, I got to put on an additional rescue thinning spray next week. Now, point number 3 is one that I would hope you'd pay good attention to. When we get to the 10 millimeter spray, after that wonderful petal fall spray, usually the bottom half of the tree is thinned better than the top. And so at that petal fall spray, I asked you to nozzle your sprayer with 2/3 of the spray going to the top and 1/3 to the bottom. But for this spray, I wanted even more extreme, 75% of the spray going to the top and only 25% going to the bottom. And you'll probably end up with really good thinning in both the top and the bottom. Now, one additional caution, if there was frost damage, then we simply turn off all the bottom nozzles and don't do any thinning to the half of the tree. bottom half, because there'll be enough drift down that we'll get enough thinning and enough shading that we'll get enough thinning. Now let me end with these 2 points, number 5 and 6. I usually recommend against Regulate. Now it can help the response of NAA. And this year, since there's no carbohydrate deficit, Regulate can help. Now, if you put Regulate with Maxell, it doesn't help because Maxell already comes preloaded with a lot of surfactant. So Regulate only really helps NAA sprays. So varieties where you're worried that you won't get the thinning you want, Honeycrisp that are way too heavy, they have 300 plus fruits, or Max that are way too heavy, a pint of Regulate will really help in these cool years. Now, if you wait until Monday when we're in the 70s, then I would not put the Regulate in the NA sprays. Don't ever put oil in this timing with the 10 to 13 millimeters. If we need an 18 millimeter spray, then we do add oil because that's the only way to make these things work at 18 millimeters. The fruits rapidly lose sensitivity to NA after they're 16 millimeters. And so if we need more thinning, we have to go with it.
Terrence, I think we might have lost your voice again. Can you
Okay,
still hear me?
I've stopped talking and just waiting for questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Terrence. With that, I think we can go ahead and open it up for questions then. Feel free to type your questions into the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself as well.
So Mike, did you see the last summary slide?
I did, yes.
Okay, and so after that, there was nothing. I just said thank you and be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, as people collect their thoughts on some questions, I do have a few for you that were sent in earlier. And I think you touched on this, Terrence, but I think it probably would be worth reviewing again. So we got a question. Yesterday, galas were at 8, 9, and 10 millimeters. Again, with that cool weather coming, when would Maxell application be the right time?
So especially with galas where we want to use Maxell, I think, and they're not really that big yet, I think we wait. And I think you just shoot for Memorial Day, the 31st, on a day that we're going to have temperatures in the mid 70s. So Maxell works much, much better if it's applied on days with 75, and then the next few days are in the 70s. So that one I would wait.
Okay, great. Thank you. We also had a question. We're probably a little past the point for this now, but with the high today being 90, you had mentioned that there's the potential to get a little bit more thinning with that. With it being that temperature with Maxell, are you concerned with over thinning?
No, not at all. And I base that on this 16-year study we did, where we took the data for 16 years and tried to look at, is the temperature the day of application the major factor, or is it the temperature the day after, 1 day after, 2 days after, 3 days after? We looked at all possible combinations of days before the day of spraying and the day after. And yes, the temperature of the day of spraying does have an influence, but it's not the influence that determines the majority of the response. It's really the temperatures on day 1 after and day 2 after. Because the first day it takes it up, but the metabolism and what's acting on the plant happens, over the next several days. So the fact that tomorrow is going to be cool, I don't know if there's enough time to get it on this afternoon and get what you want. I think the best option is to wait.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate you verifying that. We do have another question that came in. Your recommendations for Pink Lady.
Pink Lady tends to thin quite easily to us. But my first question is, who in the world up there is growing Pink Lady? Because you can never ripen the dang thing. Well, anyway, it's a side. So what we suggest for Pink Lady is a relatively modest dose. If temperatures were hot, I would say only 1 or 2 ounces of NaA plus Carburetor. But since temperatures are cool, 2 ounces of NaA or 5 parts plus a pint of 7 is probably a reasonably safe but effective treatment.
Okay, great. Thank you. We do have another question that came in. On 4-year-old trees that are loaded and have received multiple thinning applications at this point, what would you recommend to spray to bring fruit down as far as fruit numbers go and to help preserve a bloom next year?
Okay, tell me that again.
4-year-old trees that are still loaded up with fruit, what would you recommend putting on them to help get that fruit number down and to make sure they have a good return bloom next year? And these are for both Honeycrisp and Gala.
Okay. So when a tree is 4 years old, it's still in this transition between a young tree and an adult tree. And so I'm a little more cautious with them. Let me first address Honeycrisp. If Honeycrisp, and this is a real problem, it's often that third year when they overcrop. Now, maybe some people push it off to the fourth year. But if that happens, they just hang out on the next. They're just too young and they start in a biennial cycle that we want to avoid at all costs. And the cool temperatures that we've got, I would go with a full dose, the 3 ounces of NA plus a pint of 7. Now, if you wait until the end of this period and it's in the 70s, I would cut that to 2 ounces of NA. So my basic rule is on younger trees, I'm going to go with 2/3 of a normal rate. Our normal rate on Honeycrisp is 3 ounces. So 2/3 of that's 2 ounces. But since it's so cold, if you end up spraying Honeycrisp today, tomorrow, the next day before Monday, I'd put it back up to the full rate. But additionally, I'm going to give you next week. Well, did I put that in here? And I forgot to move that slide over. Let me show one slide that I showed in the Hudson Valley, because I thought maybe I'd wait and talk about it next week, but I think maybe it's better that I talk about it right now. So this is what I was going to show you next week, but I'll show you right now. I have decided to make a specific recommendation on repeat bloom that's slightly different than what we said in the past. Now, number one on this slide is what we've suggested in the past. So for other more mildly biennial varieties, and in that case, I would include Golden Delicious, McCowan, I would include Spur Red Delicious, John of Gold. What we've normally said is wait until fruits get to be 25 millimeters and then start a regimen of 4 sprays of either ethereal or NA, either one work, at 10-day intervals. Now for the Hudson Valley, I'm estimating that's going to be June 10th. But for the Champlain Valley, it's going to be, I think, June 21st, 25th, somewhere in there. So your sprays would be the last week of June and the first 3 weeks of July. But specifically for these newer varieties that are more difficult, especially Honeycrisp, and secondly, Fuji, I want to start earlier. And this is the big change that I'm hoping will work. And I've just thought about it a long time, but want to say it anyway. We've only tested it 1 year, and it worked last year. But a number of people in Washington have been trying this for a few more years. But it is that next week, about the 16 to 18 millimeters timing, start adding a low dose of ethereal to the tank. Now, the normal dose of ethereal is 1 pint per 100. Now, on a 200-gallon tree, that ends up being 2 pints per acre. But I'm afraid to do that at 16 millimeters because if it turns hot, ethereal can be a potent thinner. If it's cool, it's not very good. And so we don't want it to thin. We just want it to induce flowering. So next week when we have our meeting, I'll be repeating this. You would start in that week, your rescue spray, adding a 1/2 pint of ethereal per 100 on a dilute tree row volume basis, so that on trees that are really 200-gallon trees, you'd be putting a pint to the acre. And then follow that with 4 full sprays of ethereal at 10-day intervals. So if fruits grow about 8 millimeters a week, and we start at 16, the first spray, the second spray will go on at 24, the next spray will go on at 32 millimeters, and the last spray will go on about 40 millimeters. Then I'm going to suggest you add 2 more sprays of NAA in whichever tanks you're spraying in late July and early August for apple maggot. So that's a new thought. And so if we go back to your original question, Mike, what to do about Honeycrisp that are young, I would like to get them sprayed now. Because it's cool, I think we should go with the 3 ounces of NA plus Carburetor. If you wait to spray next Monday and Tuesday when it's warmer, cut it to 2 ounces of NA per 100. But then I hope we're going to add these ethereal sprays to it coming the following week, and then every cover spray after that for 4 of them, so that we'll get repeat bloom on them better than if we had not done that. Now, the last part of your question was on Gala, what to do with 4-year-old Gala trees. Here, return bloom is not really the concern, but fruit size is. And so if they're way overloaded and you spray under these cool conditions, I would suggest that you put on a relatively high dose of Maxell. Now, this is a caution that I want to give. When trees are young, they're much more sensitive to Maxell. In the first years we started doing this, we completely defruited some young Gala trees. So I've suggested for mature Gala trees, 64 ounces on a tree row volume basis, which turns out to be about a gallon, not 60, twice the 64, about a gallon to the acre. But with young Gala trees that are only 4 years old, I want to put on only 2/3 of that, which is 48 ounces of Maxell concentrated to the right tree row volume, and a pint of 7. But there, we're not going to worry about return bloom. It'll come back anyway. It was a long answer. I hope it was helpful.
All right, thank you, Terrence. We do have another question coming in. Because I'm on the late end of the 250-degree days already, is it okay if I wait until Friday to spray since tomorrow's temperatures are going to be so low?
Yes. So it's a continuum. If you're measuring 13 millimeter fruits already, there'll be 14 millimeters by then, and that'll still work. It's when we get past 16 millimeters that we really see the drop in effectiveness. Now, when I devised that precision thinning protocol, I wanted to have like a week in between them. And that's why we defined 10 to 13 and then 16 to 18. But it'll still work at 14 and probably work pretty decent if the biggest are 15, but the bulk of them are 14. So I would wait.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question in the chat box. It's been very dry here, and I'd say that's very much the case around the entire Champlain Valley at this point. Does water stress complicate the carbohydrate model?
Yes, it does. But that part's been difficult to quantify. And the only way that I can really do it is measure stem water potentials. So even though it has been dry, I really wonder whether we're getting stress, significant stress in the trees themselves. You can see it when it's past the point of significant because you see wilting. But if you see wilting, then all bets are off. It's just way beyond. But what I don't know, and the only way to really look at it is with the pressure bomb stem water potentials. And I think we've had you do some of that before, Mike. I can't remember, but I only have one machine and it's in Geneva. But when I can detect water stress, then we start to get more thinning with any given temperature. So if we're thinning under warm temperatures and the water stress, we get more thinning. But I just don't know if we're there yet. I know it's dry, but I don't think we're at the level where the trees are sensing a tremendous amount of stress. What do you think?
I'm not sure at this point. We do have soil moisture meters in the ground. I can certainly take a look at some of the ones that we still have out.
Well, that would be great information.
I do think last year, I think we were in a very similar situation, and I remember it was very hot during our petal fall sprays, and I think we saw a lot of people were concerned, and I think we did end up seeing it. In some cases, we saw more June drop than we might have otherwise expected.
Yeah. But last year stayed dry all through the month of June, and we got
Right.
into much more serious drought in mid to late June. Who knows what this year will bring? I'm expecting rain any day.
Sure. We can certainly hope.
But I guess my basic answer is this. We're still on the early side of a drought cycle, and I don't think these thinners will be affected much by it that go on this week. Now, what happens mid-June if it stays dry, then we'll probably see more June drop. Now, I've said for years, one of the problems with the thinning is that we make those decisions now, but we don't know the effect of drought through the whole summer on fruit size. So on very dry years, we should carry lower fruit numbers. So if our target was, say, 150, if it's going to be really dry, we should only be carrying 125 or 100 fruits. But we don't know that right now when we're trying to decide how many fruits we want to leave on that tree. But if it does get really dry, going into hand thinning off another 25 fruits helps.
All right. Thank you, Terrence. I did have another question as well. And as if anybody else has other questions that haven't been addressed yet, feel free to type them into the chat box or take yourself off of mute and feel free to ask them directly. My next question for you, Terrence, we got ourselves into this situation with some of the trials we have in Peru, where we hit our pedal fall thinner application for sort of that tail end of that window. And then we want to do those fruit growth measurements, but we're concerned that if we wait that full amount of time, we're going to miss the tail end of that 10 to 12 window. In your recommendation, would you say to still wait that full amount of time and
No,
put?
no, it's a great question, and I should have addressed that. It's more critical to take the measurement in time to make a decision about this 10 millimeter. Let's suppose you take my suggestion, you wait till Monday. I want to have those measurements before I decide how much I'm putting in the tank on Monday. So I would wait as long as possible, but I'd take them earlier than you suggested, just to have that data before I put on this next spray.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're planning for Sunday.
Unfortunately, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's the way it goes this time of year.
Okay. Yeah, I know that some of those pedal fall sprays went on late, but I'll repeat and say that when they went on late, they went on under less favorable thinning conditions. So there might even be less response from them than the earlier ones. But I know bees were still out. We still had pedals out on a lot of stuff for the earlier timing. So it's just been a difficult year to get them on. And the deficits probably in the Champlain disappeared before people got bees or out or pedals all the way off.
All right. Well, I do not see any other questions coming at the moment. I can leave it open for another minute or so. If people have last minute thoughts, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself or type them in.
Well, it's odd that the best time is going to be Memorial Day, but my suggestion is there's nothing to do right now. Have your party today or tomorrow or the next day and then work on Monday.
Certainly with the day of rest, it complicates things as well. So yeah, it's been difficult to schedule this time of year. All right. Well, not seeing any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and conclude for the day. Thank you, Terrence, for joining us with your recommendations, and thank you all for calling in. We do have this meeting recorded, and we'll get that out to folks in the next day or so. And I'll also be summarizing Terrence's recommendations and getting that out in an email sometime tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. And we'll be coming back sometime next week for our rescue thinner talk. So keep an eye out for the announcement of what date that's going to be.
Okay, thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.